All right, let me ask you something real quick. Have you ever followed doctor approved diet advice perfectly, counted calories, eaten low fat foods, avoided red meat, snacked every few hours, and still gained weight, felt tired, hungry, or even worse than before? If that sounds familiar, you're not failing the diet is failing you. And today I want to talk about the number one worst diet advice that's still being repeated by doctors, dietitians, and health organizations around the world, and how it's quietly making people sicker instead of healthier. For decades, we were told one simple thing: eat less and move more. Cut calories, choose low fat foods, eat small meals frequently, and everything will magically fix itself. Sounds logical, right? Calories in, calories out. But here's the problem: your body is not a calculator. It's a hormonal system. And when you ignore hormones, especially insulin, everything falls apart. When you constantly restrict calories while eating the wrong kinds of foods, your body doesn't say, "Oh, great, we're getting healthier." It says, "We're starving." And when your body thinks it's starving, it slows your metabolism, increases hunger hormones, and makes you obsess about food. That's why people feel tired, cold, irritable, and eventually binge or quit altogether. And then they blame themselves for having no willpower. For years, people have been told that weight gain and weight loss are nothing more than a simple math equation: calories in versus calories out. And if you just eat less and move more, everything will fall into place. But real life never works that way, because the human body is not a spreadsheet, and it doesn't respond to numbers, it responds to signals. And the most powerful signals, it responds to our hormones that decide whether you burn energy or store it, whether you feel hungry or satisfied, and whether your metabolism speeds up or shuts down. So when someone cuts calories without understanding what those calories are doing hormonally, the body doesn't see that as health. It sees it as danger, and survival mode kicks in almost immediately. When calories are reduced but insulin stays high, because the diet is built around sugar, refined carbohydrates, and constant snacking, the body is trapped in a state where it can't access its own fat stores. Insulin is the hormone that tells your body to store energy, and as long as insulin remains elevated, fat burning is essentially locked off. So even though someone may be eating less, their body still behaves as if it has no fuel available, which is why hunger becomes intense, energy crashes happen, and cravings feel uncontrollable. At the same time, the body adapts to this perceived shortage by slowing down metabolism. Thyroid activity decreases, resting energy expenditure drops, and the body becomes more efficient at surviving on fewer calories, not healthier, just better at conserving energy. This is why people often lose a little weight at first and then hit a wall where nothing happens no matter how hard they try. And this is also why weight almost always comes back once normal eating resumes, because the metabolism has been suppressed and fat storage hormones are still dominant. This is where the calorie model completely falls apart, because two people can eat the same number of calories and have completely different outcomes depending on their hormonal environment. Someone eating 2,000 calories of real food with stable insulin can lose fat and feel energized, while someone else eating 2,000 calories of processed low-fat food can gain weight and feel exhausted. Yet the advice stays the same: eat less, try harder, move more, as if biology doesn't matter. The tragedy is that people internalize this failure and blame themselves. They think they lack discipline or willpower, when in reality they are fighting against powerful survival mechanisms that evolved to protect them. The body always prioritizes survival over aesthetics. And when it senses energy restriction paired with high insulin, it will defend fat mass aggressively. Hunger hormones rise, stress hormones increase, and fat burning becomes even more difficult. Once you understand that weight regulation is controlled by hormones, not calorie math, everything starts to make sense. It explains why chronic dieting leads to burnout, why people regain weight faster than they lost it, and why focusing on food quality and metabolic signals works better than counting numbers. When insulin is lowered and the body is allowed to access stored energy, hunger naturally decreases and metabolism stabilizes, not because of willpower, but because the body is no longer in survival mode. This shift in understanding is powerful because it removes shame from the equation. It reframes weight struggles as a biological response rather than a personal failure, and it opens the door to approaches that work with the body instead of against it, approaches that prioritize hormonal balance, metabolic health, and long-term sustainability rather than endless restriction and frustration. When people are told that the solution to weight gain is simply to eat less, what they're really being told is to ignore the body's built-in survival systems, because the moment calories are aggressively reduced, the body does not interpret that as a healthy lifestyle choice. It interprets it as famine, and once that alarm is triggered, a whole cascade of biological responses begins that work directly against fat loss and overall well-being. One of the first things that happens during chronic calorie restriction is a slowdown in metabolism. The body becomes more efficient at conserving energy, resting metabolic rate drops, and fewer calories are burned at rest, not because something is broken, but because the body is trying to keep you alive. This means that the same amount of food that once maintained weight now leads to gain, and people are left confused as to why nothing works anymore. At the same time, hunger hormones like ghrelin rise while satiety hormones fall, making food feel constantly on the mind, cravings intensify, and portion control feels nearly impossible. This isn't a lack of discipline. It's biology pushing you to seek energy, and the longer restriction continues, the louder these hunger signals become, often leading to binge episodes that feel sudden and uncontrollable, but are actually predictable responses to prolonged deprivation. Energy levels also take a hit. People notice they feel tired even after sleeping, workouts feel harder, recovery takes longer, and everyday tasks feel more draining. This happens because the body reduces non-essential energy use, spontaneous movement drops, and the nervous system shifts into conservation mode. Even mental sharpness and mood can suffer as the brain senses a lack of reliable fuel. Cold sensitivity is another common sign. Hands and feet feel colder, tolerance to temperature drops. And this is tied to reduced thyroid signaling. Thyroid hormones play a major role in regulating metabolic rate and heat production, and when calories stay low for long periods, the body downregulates these hormones to preserve energy, further slowing metabolism and reinforcing the cycle over time. Stress hormones like cortisol increase as the body remains under constant perceived threat. Elevated cortisol not only promotes fat storage, especially around the abdomen, but also worsens insulin resistance, disrupts sleep, and increases emotional eating, creating a perfect storm where the harder someone diets, the more their body resists change. Psychologically, this pattern is exhausting. People start out motivated, but as hunger, fatigue, and frustration build, adherence becomes harder, guilt sets in when the plan is broken, and eventually the diet is abandoned altogether, not because the person failed, but because the approach was never sustainable for a human body designed to adapt and survive. When normal eating resumes, metabolism is still suppressed, while appetite remains elevated, leading to rapid weight regain, often surpassing the original weight, reinforcing the belief that something is wrong with the person rather than the method. But once you understand that chronic calorie restriction creates these predictable responses, it becomes clear that long-term health cannot be built on constant deprivation, and that real progress requires supporting the body's metabolic and hormonal balance rather than fighting against it. For a long time, people were told that dietary fat was the main reason for weight gain and heart disease. And this single idea shaped decades of nutrition advice, food guidelines, and even medical recommendations. So naturally, people began cutting fat wherever they could, choosing low fat milk, low fat yogurt, fat free snacks, and margarine instead of butter, believing they were making the healthiest choice possible. What most people didn't realize is that when fat is removed from food, something has to replace it to make the food taste acceptable. And that replacement was almost always sugar, refined carbohydrates, and artificial additives. So the very foods labeled as healthy became some of the most insulin spiking items in the diet: breakfast cereals, flavored yogurts, granola bars, fruit juices, and whole grain breads all carried the health high-low while quietly pushing blood sugar and insulin higher throughout the day. Insulin is the hormone that tells the body to store energy, and when insulin is repeatedly elevated, fat storage becomes the default state, especially in the liver and abdomen. This means that even though people were eating fewer grams of fat, their bodies were being signaled to store more body fat, a cruel contradiction that left many doing everything right according to guidelines and still gaining weight. Low fat diets also tend to be less satisfying. Fat plays a major role in satiety, hormone production, and nutrient absorption. When meals lack adequate fat, people feel hungry sooner, cravings return quickly, and portion sizes creep up as the body searches for satisfaction. This leads to frequent eating and snacking, which further compounds the insulin problem and keeps the body locked in storage mode. Another overlooked issue is that fat is essential for the absorption of fat-soluble vitamins like A, D, E, and K. When fat intake stays chronically low, deficiencies can develop even in people eating enough calories, affecting immune function, bone health, skin quality, and hormonal balance. Yet these symptoms are rarely connected back to the low fat advice that caused them. The shift away from natural fats also led to increased consumption of industrial seed oils and highly processed replacements. These oils are often unstable and easily oxidized, contributing to inflammation in the body, which further worsens insulin resistance and metabolic dysfunction, making fat loss even harder despite adherence to low fat recommendations. What makes this advice especially damaging is that it framed fat as something to fear rather than a tool for metabolic health. Healthy fats slow digestion, stabilize blood sugar, and reduce insulin spikes when eaten with meals. They help keep hunger under control and allow the body to access stored energy more easily. But for years, people were told to avoid them at all costs. As a result, an entire generation learned to fear foods that humans had eaten for centuries while embracing highly processed substitutes. And the outcome speaks for itself in rising rates of obesity, diabetes, and fatty liver disease. The low-fat message wasn't just ineffective, it pushed people in the opposite direction of metabolic health. And understanding this helps explain why so many people followed the rules faithfully and still ended up worse than before. One of the most harmful ideas to come out of modern nutrition advice is the belief that eating frequently keeps the metabolism high and prevents weight gain. So people were told to eat every 2 or 3 hours, never skip breakfast, carry snacks everywhere, and treat hunger as an emergency rather than a normal signal. And while this advice sounds harmless, it quietly disrupts the body's natural metabolic rhythm. Every time food is eaten, insulin is released to manage the incoming energy, and insulin's primary job is to move nutrients into storage, especially fat storage. This means that the more often you eat, the more often insulin is elevated, and when insulin is constantly high throughout the day, the body never gets the signal to switch into fat burning mode. Instead, it remains locked in storage mode, even if total calorie intake is not excessive. In a healthy metabolic state, insulin rises after a meal and then falls back down, allowing the body to access stored energy between meals. But when snacks are added every few hours, insulin barely has time to come down before it is pushed back up again. Over time, this leads to insulin resistance, where cells stop responding properly, and even more insulin is required to manage the same amount of food, creating a vicious cycle. Constant eating also interferes with the body's ability to repair and reset. Periods without food are when important processes like cellular cleanup, hormone regulation, and metabolic flexibility occur. Without these breaks, the body stays in a perpetual fed state, which may feel normal in modern life, but is far from how human metabolism evolved to function. Many people notice that when they eat frequently, hunger actually increases rather than decreases, blood sugar rises and falls more rapidly, leading to energy crashes and cravings that are mistaken for the need to eat again. This roller coaster reinforces the habit of snacking and makes it feel impossible to go even a few hours without food. Even though the body has ample stored energy available, the psychological impact of this advice is also significant. People become anxious about missing meals, fear hunger, and feel the need to plan their entire day around eating, which keeps food constantly on the mind and makes healthy habits harder to sustain. Instead of listening to natural hunger cues, they follow the clock, often eating when they are not truly hungry. For individuals already struggling with insulin resistance or weight gain, frequent eating is especially damaging. It prevents insulin from ever dropping low enough to allow fat burning, and even exercise becomes less effective because the body remains in a glucose burning, storage focused state, leading to frustration when effort does not translate into results. When people finally reduce snacking and allow longer gaps between meals, something interesting happens. Hunger becomes more stable, energy levels even out, and the body relearns how to switch between fuel sources, not through force or deprivation, but through hormonal balance. And this highlights how deeply flawed the constant eating advice truly is, because instead of supporting metabolism, it keeps the body trapped in a cycle of dependence, storage, and resistance. Most people assume that when diet advice comes from a doctor, it must be deeply researched and up to date. But the reality is that the majority of doctors receive very little formal education in nutrition, and even less in metabolic and hormonal health. Medical training is heavily focused on diagnosing disease, prescribing medication, and managing acute conditions, not on understanding how food, insulin, and metabolism interact over decades to shape long-term health. In many medical schools, nutrition education is limited to a few lectures, often based on outdated guidelines that emphasize calorie balance, low fat eating, and frequent meals. These guidelines are rarely questioned because they are presented as settled science. And once doctors enter practice, there is little incentive or time to revisit them, especially when clinical systems reward quick visits and medication-based solutions. As a result, many doctors simply repeat what they were taught, not because they are lazy or malicious, but because the system itself discourages deep exploration of lifestyle-based interventions. It is far easier to prescribe a pill for high blood sugar or cholesterol than to spend time explaining insulin dynamics, food quality, and long-term behavioral change, especially when insurance structures do not support extended nutritional counseling. Another problem is that nutritional science itself has been heavily influenced by industry funding and historical assumptions. Early research demonized fat and oversimplified heart disease, leading to guidelines that shaped medical education for decades. Even as new evidence emerged, the old frameworks remained in place because changing official recommendations is slow, political, and often controversial. Doctors are also trained to rely on consensus and authority, which works well in many areas of medicine, but can become a limitation when consensus is based on incomplete or flawed models. Questioning dietary guidelines can feel risky, especially for practitioners who fear professional criticism or liability. So many continue to follow protocols even when they see patients struggling under those recommendations. Patients sense this disconnect. They follow advice faithfully, cut calories, eat low-fat foods, snack frequently, and yet their weight, blood sugar, and energy worsen over time. When they return to the doctor, the advice is often to try harder or add medication, which reinforces the idea that lifestyle failure, not biological mismatch, is the problem. The tragedy is that doctors often treat the symptoms of metabolic dysfunction without addressing the root cause. High blood sugar is managed with drugs rather than insulin resistance. High cholesterol is treated without questioning diet quality or inflammation. And weight gain is blamed on behavior rather than hormonal signaling. This approach can manage numbers on a lab report while underlying health continues to decline as research continues to evolve. It is becoming clear that many chronic conditions are driven by metabolic dysfunction that begins long before disease is diagnosed. Yet the gap between emerging science and clinical practice remains wide until medical education places greater emphasis on nutrition, metabolism, and prevention. Outdated advice will continue to circulate, not because doctors don't care, but because the system has not yet caught up with the biology. Real, lasting health does not come from forcing the body into submission through constant restriction, willpower, and guilt. It comes from creating an internal environment where the body naturally works in your favor, and that begins with understanding insulin and how it responds to the foods you eat and the timing of your meals, because insulin is the master hormone that decides whether energy is burned or stored. When insulin levels are chronically high, the body is locked in storage mode, fat cannot be accessed, hunger remains elevated, and energy feels unstable. But when insulin is allowed to come down, the body regains access to stored fuel, appetite becomes calmer, and metabolism stabilizes without conscious effort. This is why lowering insulin is so central to sustainable weight loss and metabolic health. Lowering insulin is not about starvation. It is about reducing constant stimulation. This means focusing on whole, minimally processed foods that do not spike blood sugar aggressively, prioritizing protein to support muscle and satiety, and including healthy fats that slow digestion and stabilize hormonal responses. When meals are built this way, the need to snack naturally decreases and eating becomes more intuitive rather than controlled. Equally important is giving the body time between meals. Periods without food allow insulin to fall and fat burning to turn on. They also activate repair processes that help restore metabolic flexibility. This does not require extreme fasting or rigid rules. Simply reducing unnecessary snacking and allowing hunger to guide eating can create profound changes over time. One of the most powerful shifts people experience when they stop blaming themselves and start working with their biology is a sense of relief. Hunger no longer feels like an enemy, food no longer feels like a constant negotiation, and progress no longer depends on obsessive tracking. Instead, the body begins to self-regulate, signaling when it needs food and when it has had enough. This approach also supports long-term health beyond weight. Stable insulin improves blood sugar control, reduces inflammation, supports hormonal balance, and lowers the risk of chronic diseases that develop silently over years. Energy becomes more consistent, mental clarity improves, and physical activity feels easier rather than punishing. Perhaps most importantly, this perspective restores trust between people and their bodies. Instead of fighting hunger, fearing fat, or counting every calorie, individuals learn to listen to internal signals and make choices that support metabolic health naturally. This creates sustainability because it fits human biology rather than fighting it. When health strategies are built on insulin awareness, real food, and adequate recovery time between meals, results become predictable and repeatable, not because of discipline, but because the body is no longer under constant stress. And this is why sustainable weight loss is not about eating less or exercising more, but about creating the right hormonal environment and allowing the body to do what it was designed to do.